All thought she was only a maid, but the general froze when she spoke in 7 different languages. Elena Martinez wiped the sweat from her forehead as she scrubbed the marble floors of the grand mansion. The early morning sun streamed through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the pristine hallway. She had been working as a maid for the Blackwood family for 3 years now, and every day felt the same. Wake up at 5, clean until midnight, sleep, and repeat. The other servants barely acknowledged her existence. Mrs. Henderson, the head housekeeper, treated her like she was invisible. The gardeners would nod politely but never engaged in conversation. Even the cook, Maria, who was supposed to be friendly to everyone, seemed to look right through Elena whenever she entered the kitchen. Elena didn't mind the invisibility. It gave her time to think, to remember, and sometimes to forget. She preferred the quiet moments when she could lose herself in her work and let her mind wander to better times. Times when she wore silk dresses instead of a plain gray uniform. Times when people hung on her every word instead of expecting her to remain silent. The Blackwood mansion was preparing for something big. Elena could sense the nervous energy in the air. Extra staff had been hired for the week, and Mrs. Henderson had been barking orders at everyone since dawn. The silver was being polished twice, the carpets were being cleaned with extra care, and even the flowers in the garden were being trimmed to perfection. Elena, hurry up with those floors, Mrs. Henderson called out sharply. General Morrison is arriving this afternoon and everything must be spotless. This is the most important guest the Blackwoods have ever hosted. Elena nodded silently and continued scrubbing. She had heard whispers about General Morrison throughout the week. He was apparently some kind of military hero who had served in multiple countries. The staff spoke about him with a mixture of fear and respect. Some said he was brilliant but cold. Others mentioned that he had a temper that could make grown men shake. As Elena worked her way down the hallway, she overheard 2 of the temporary staff talking in hushed voices. "I heard he speaks 5 languages," whispered one. "My cousin worked for him briefly. Said he's incredibly smart but doesn't tolerate mistakes," replied the other. Elena smiled to herself. 5 languages seemed impressive to them. If only they knew what she was capable of. But those days were behind her now. She was just Elena the maid, invisible and unremarkable. The afternoon arrived with a flurry of activity. Black cars pulled up to the mansion's circular driveway. Elena watched from an upstairs window as men in expensive suits stepped out. She recognized the pattern of authority in their movements, the way they carried themselves with confidence and purpose. Then she saw him. General Morrison stepped out of the lead car with the bearing of someone who commanded respect without demanding it. He was tall and distinguished, with graying hair at his temples and sharp blue eyes that seemed to take in everything around him. Even from her distant window, Elena could see the intelligence in his face. Mr. Blackwood, the mansion's owner, practically ran down the front steps to greet his guest. Elena watched as the 2 men shook hands and exchanged what appeared to be friendly conversation. The general's entourage followed them into the house, and Elena quickly moved away from the window to continue her duties. The dinner that evening was elaborate. Elena and the other servants worked tirelessly to ensure everything went perfectly. She carried trays of food from the kitchen to the dining room, staying invisible as always. The conversations at the table were animated, with talk of business deals, international affairs, and military strategies. Elena tried not to listen too carefully, but she couldn't help noticing the general's voice. It was deep and measured, with the kind of authority that came from years of making important decisions. When he spoke, everyone at the table listened intently. As the evening progressed, Elena noticed something interesting. The general would occasionally use words from different languages when speaking with various guests. A phrase in French to the ambassador's wife, a greeting in Italian to a business partner. Each time, the recipient seemed impressed and pleased. After dinner, the guests moved to the library for drinks and cigars. Elena was assigned to serve coffee and clean up any spills or ash. She moved quietly around the room, refilling cups and emptying ashtrays while the men discussed their affairs. "The situation in Eastern Europe is more complex than most people realize," the general was saying, to a group of attentive listeners. "You can't understand the true dynamics without speaking to people in their native tongues." Mr. Blackwood nodded enthusiastically. "Your linguistic abilities are legendary, General. 5 languages, isn't it?" The general smiled modestly. "A soldier learns what he needs to survive and succeed." Elena continued her work, but her mind was racing. 5 languages. She remembered when that would have seemed like a modest accomplishment to her. When speaking 7 languages fluently was just part of her daily routine. When switching between German and Mandarin in the same conversation was as natural as breathing. As the evening wound down, Elena helped clear the final glasses and ashtrays. The guests were preparing to retire to their rooms or head home. The general was staying at the mansion for several days, which meant the heightened level of service would continue. Elena made her way back to the servants' quarters, her mind full of memories she usually tried to suppress. The sound of different languages being spoken had awakened something in her that she had kept buried for 3 years. Something that reminded her of who she used to be before she became invisible. In her small room, Elena sat on her narrow bed and looked at herself in the cracked mirror on the wall. The woman staring back at her looked tired and worn down. Her once elegant hands were now rough from cleaning. Her eyes, which used to sparkle with intelligence and ambition, now seemed dull and resigned. But tonight felt different. Something about hearing those familiar linguistic patterns, about seeing the respect that language skills could command, had stirred something deep inside her. Elena touched her throat gently, as if testing whether her voice still worked the way it used to. Tomorrow would bring another day of scrubbing floors and being invisible. But for the first time in 3 years, Elena Martinez found herself wondering what would happen if she decided not to be invisible anymore. What would happen if the maid they all ignored suddenly revealed that she was so much more than anyone could have imagined? The next morning brought unexpected chaos to the Blackwood mansion. Elena was polishing the banister when she heard raised voices coming from the library. She paused in her work, recognizing the sound of frustration and panic in the voices. Mrs. Henderson rushed past, looking more flustered than Elena had ever seen her. The head housekeeper's usually perfect hair was disheveled, and her face was flushed with stress. "Where is Mr. Patterson?" Mrs. Henderson called out to no one in particular. "The interpreter was supposed to be here an hour ago." Elena continued polishing, but her ears were alert. An interpreter? That could only mean one thing. General Morrison had business that required language skills beyond his own 5 languages. Through the open library door, Elena could see General Morrison pacing back and forth while Mr. Blackwood frantically made phone calls. Several other men sat around the large mahogany table, looking uncomfortable and checking their watches repeatedly. "Sir, I understand your frustration," Mr. Blackwood was saying into his phone, "but we need someone immediately. The general has a conference call with Beijing in 30 minutes, and then meetings with delegates from 7 different countries throughout the day." Elena's heart started beating faster. Beijing. That meant Mandarin. She had learned Mandarin from her grandmother, who had worked as a translator for international businesses for 40 years. Elena could speak it as fluently as English, switching between the different dialects without even thinking about it. But she forced herself to keep polishing. She was just a maid, invisible, unremarkable. "This is unacceptable," General Morrison's voice carried clearly from the library. "Mr. Patterson was highly recommended. How does a professional interpreter simply not show up for the most important diplomatic meeting of the month?" Mr. Blackwood hung up his phone with obvious frustration. "I'm trying every agency in the city, General. But it's short notice, and most of the qualified interpreters are already booked." Elena moved closer to the library door, pretending to dust a nearby vase. Through the doorway, she could see a stack of documents on the table. Even from a distance, she could make out text in multiple languages. Chinese characters, Arabic script, what looked like Russian Cyrillic letters, and text in several European languages. Her fingers itched to touch those papers, to read them, to translate them. She hadn't used her language skills in 3 years, but they were still there, sharp and ready. Like a pianist whose fingers remember the keys even after years away from the instrument. "General, I have another agency on the line," Mr. Blackwood announced with hope in his voice. "They might have someone available." Elena listened as Mr. Blackwood explained the situation to yet another agency. She watched through the doorway as General Morrison continued to pace, his jaw set in a hard line. The other men at the table were growing visibly more anxious as time passed. "What do you mean he doesn't speak Arabic?" Mr. Blackwood's voice rose in desperation. The Syrian delegation specifically requested Arabic interpretation. "This is a disaster." General Morrison stopped pacing and turned to face Mr. Blackwood. "How long until you can find someone qualified?" "They're saying possibly this afternoon, but more likely tomorrow morning." Tomorrow morning. The general's voice was dangerously quiet. I have delegations from China, Syria, Russia, Germany, France, Italy, and Spain arriving throughout the day. Some of these meetings cannot be postponed. There are military contracts worth millions of dollars at stake. Elena felt her pulse quicken. China, Syria, Russia, Germany, France, Italy, Spain. Mandarin, Arabic, Russian, German, French, Italian, Spanish. 7 languages. 7 languages that she spoke fluently. She tried to focus on her dusting, but her hands were trembling slightly. This was exactly the kind of high-level diplomatic work she had done before everything changed, before she became invisible. "Sir," one of the men at the table spoke up hesitantly, "perhaps we could reschedule some of the meetings." General Morrison's expression made it clear that rescheduling was not an option. "Gentlemen, some of these delegates have traveled thousands of miles specifically for today's discussions. Rescheduling could damage relationships that have taken years to build." Elena set down her duster and found herself walking toward the library door. She didn't plan it. Her feet just started moving on their own, driven by something deeper than conscious thought. She stood in the doorway for a moment, her heart pounding. The men in the room were so focused on their crisis that they didn't notice her immediately. Elena cleared her throat softly. General Morrison looked up first, his sharp blue eyes focusing on her with mild irritation. "Yes?" Elena felt her voice catch in her throat. It had been so long since anyone in this house had asked her opinion about anything more complex than which cleaning product to use. "Excuse me, sir," she said quietly. "I couldn't help but overhear. You need someone who speaks Chinese, Arabic, Russian, German, French, Italian, and Spanish?" Mr. Blackwood looked at her with surprise and embarrassment. "Elena, this is not the time. Please continue with your duties." But General Morrison held up a hand, his eyes still fixed on Elena. There was something in his expression that hadn't been there before, a sharp attention like a predator that had suddenly caught an interesting scent. "Wait," he said quietly. "Let her speak." Elena felt all the eyes in the room focusing on her. For 3 years she had been invisible. Now, suddenly, she was the center of attention. The feeling was both terrifying and exhilarating. "I was just wondering," Elena continued, her voice growing slightly stronger, "what level of fluency you need. Conversational, business level, or full diplomatic interpretation?" The room fell silent. Mr. Blackwood's mouth hung open slightly. The other men exchanged puzzled glances. General Morrison's eyes narrowed, but not with irritation. "With interest. Why do you ask?" the general said slowly. Elena took a deep breath. This was the moment. She could turn around, apologize for the interruption and go back to being invisible, or she could step forward into the light and reveal who she really was. "Because," Elena said, her voice now clear and confident, "I speak all 7 of those languages fluently, and I have extensive experience in diplomatic interpretation." The silence that followed was so complete that Elena could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway. Mr. Blackwood looked like he had been struck by lightning. The other men stared at her as if she had just announced that she could fly. But General Morrison's expression was different. His eyes were sharp and calculating, studying her face with the intensity of someone who had learned to read people quickly and accurately. "You're a maid," Mr. Blackwood finally sputtered. Elena turned to look at him, and for the first time in 3 years, she smiled with real confidence. "I'm also a graduate of Georgetown University with a master's degree in international relations and linguistics," she said calmly. "I worked for the State Department for 5 years before I came here." General Morrison stepped forward, his presence commanding the room. "Prove it." General Morrison's challenge hung in the air like electricity before a storm. Elena felt the weight of everyone's stares, but strangely, she wasn't nervous anymore. This was familiar territory. This was who she used to be. "How would you like me to prove it?" Elena asked, her voice steady. The general gestured toward the documents on the table. "These contracts and briefings are in multiple languages. Start with the Chinese document on top." Elena approached the table, acutely aware that her simple gray maid's uniform looked completely out of place in this formal setting. The men stepped back to give her room, their expressions ranging from skeptical to curious. She picked up the Chinese document and scanned it quickly. It was a detailed military equipment contract with complex technical specifications, the kind of document that would challenge even experienced translators. "This is a procurement contract for advanced radar systems," Elena began. her voice taking on the professional tone she hadn't used in years. The Chinese delegation is offering a 20% discount on the standard price, but they're requesting exclusive distribution rights for the Asian market in return. She continued reading, translating the complex technical terms with ease. There's a clause here about delivery schedules that could be problematic. They're requiring installation and training to be completed within 6 months, but based on the scope of the project, that timeline seems unrealistic. General Morrison's eyebrows rose slightly. He picked up another document and handed it to her. This one's in Arabic. Elena glanced at the Arabic text and immediately recognized it as a diplomatic communication. This is from the Syrian delegation. They're expressing concerns about the security arrangements for the meeting. Specifically, they want assurance that their discussions will remain confidential and that no recording devices will be present. She looked up at General Morrison. They're also requesting that any interpreters sign additional confidentiality agreements beyond the standard diplomatic protocols. The general's expression was unreadable, but Elena could see something shifting in his eyes. Recognition, perhaps, or respect. Russian, he said, handing her a third document. Elena read through the Russian text quickly. This is more complex. It's a position paper outlining Russia's concerns about NATO expansion in Eastern Europe. The language is quite formal and diplomatic, but the underlying message is firm. They're drawing clear lines about what they will and won't accept in future negotiations. Mr. Blackwood had been standing in stunned silence, but now he found his voice. Elena, I don't understand. How is this possible? You've been working as a maid for 3 years. Why didn't you ever mention your education? Elena set down the Russian document and looked at him with sad understanding. Because you never asked. In 3 years, not one person in this house has ever asked me about my background, my education, or my life before I came here. You saw the uniform and decided that was all I was. She turned back to General Morrison, who was still watching her intently. I can continue with the other languages if you'd like, but I think you've seen enough to know that I'm qualified to help with your meetings today. General Morrison was quiet for a long moment, his sharp eyes studying her face. Finally, he spoke. What's your full name? Elena Sofia Martinez. And you worked for the State Department? Yes, sir. I specialized in international trade negotiations and diplomatic communications. I worked primarily with Asian and European delegations. Why did you leave? The question hung in the air, and Elena felt her professional composure waver slightly. This was the part she had hoped to avoid, the part that had led to her becoming invisible in the first place. Personal reasons, she said quietly. General Morrison nodded, seeming to understand that she wouldn't elaborate further. Can you be ready for the first meeting in 20 minutes? Elena looked down at her maid's uniform and then back at the general. I'll need to change clothes and review the briefing materials, but yes, I can be ready. Mrs. Henderson, Mr. Blackwood called out, still looking dazed by this turn of events. Please help Elena find something appropriate to wear. But Elena shook her head. Actually, I have suitable clothes in my room. I kept some of my professional attire. She paused, then added quietly, I never really thought I'd need it again, but I couldn't bear to get rid of it. As Elena hurried toward the servants' quarters to change, she could hear excited conversations erupting behind her in the library. The other servants she passed in the hallway stared at her with open mouths. Word was spreading quickly through the house that the invisible maid was apparently someone completely different than anyone had imagined. In her small room, Elena opened the old suitcase she kept under her bed. Inside, carefully preserved in tissue paper, were the clothes from her former life. Professional blazers, elegant blouses, tailored skirts. She chose a navy blue suit that had always made her feel confident and capable. As she changed clothes, Elena caught sight of herself in the cracked mirror. The transformation was remarkable. The professional attire changed not just how she looked, but how she carried herself. Her shoulders straightened, her chin lifted, and her eyes regained some of their old spark. She twisted her hair into a neat professional bun and applied a small amount of makeup that she had kept for occasions that never came. When she was finished, the woman in the mirror looked nothing like the invisible maid who had been scrubbing floors that morning. Elena took a deep breath and walked back toward the library. As she moved through the halls of the mansion, she noticed how differently the other servants looked at her. Some seemed confused, others impressed, and a few appeared almost resentful. as if she had been deceiving them somehow. When she entered the library, the conversation stopped abruptly. General Morrison looked up from the documents he was reviewing and studied her transformation. If he was surprised by the dramatic change in her appearance, he didn't show it. "Better," he said simply. "The Chinese delegation will be here in 10 minutes. I'll brief you on the key points of discussion, and then you'll interpret the entire meeting." Elena nodded and took her place at the table. For the first time in 3 years, she felt like herself again. The invisible maid was gone, replaced by the skilled professional she had always been underneath. As General Morrison began explaining the complex details of the upcoming negotiation, Elena found her mind sharpening with familiar focus. Technical terms, diplomatic protocols, cultural nuances, it all came flooding back like muscle memory. But even as she prepared for the challenge ahead, Elena couldn't shake the feeling that this was more than just a coincidence. General Morrison's arrival, the interpreter's mysterious absence, her sudden opportunity to step out of invisibility, it all seemed too perfectly timed to be mere chance. She pushed the thought aside as the sound of approaching cars announced the arrival of the first delegation. Whatever forces had brought this moment about, Elena was ready to prove that she was far more than anyone had ever imagined. The Chinese delegation entered the library with the quiet dignity that Elena remembered from her State Department days. 3 men in perfectly tailored dark suits led by Ambassador Chen Wei, whom Elena recognized from international news broadcasts. They moved with the measured confidence of people accustomed to high-stakes negotiations. General Morrison stood to greet them, and Elena rose as well, positioning herself slightly behind and to the right of the general's chair as protocol demanded. Ambassador Chen's eyes swept the room, pausing briefly on Elena with polite curiosity before focusing on General Morrison. "General Morrison," Ambassador Chen said in accented English, "it is an honor to meet you. Your reputation precedes you." "The honor is mine, Ambassador Chen," General Morrison replied. "Please allow me to introduce our interpreter, Ms. Martinez." Elena stepped forward and bowed slightly in the Chinese manner. 很荣幸见到您，陈大使。我是艾琳诺马丁内子，今天将为您提供翻译服务。It is an honor to meet you, Ambassador Chen. I am Elena Martinez, and I will be providing interpretation services for you today. The change in Ambassador Chen's expression was immediate and dramatic. His polite mask dropped, replaced by genuine surprise and something that looked almost like delight. He responded in rapid Mandarin, his words flowing with the subtle inflections of Beijing dialect. 您的中文说得太好了。您在中国学习过吗? Your Chinese is excellent. Did you study in China? Elena smiled, feeling the familiar pleasure of connecting with someone in their native language. 我的祖母是一位翻译，她教会了我中文的美妙之处。我也曾在北京大学进修过1年。My grandmother was a translator who taught me the beauty of Chinese. I also studied at Peking University for a year. Ambassador Chen turned to his colleagues and said something quickly in Mandarin. Elena caught every word. He was telling them that this was unexpected, that the interpreter was far more qualified than most they encountered in America, and that this might actually be a productive meeting after all. General Morrison watched this exchange with sharp attention. Elena could feel his eyes on her as she seamlessly switched between languages, her entire demeanor shifting slightly with each linguistic transition. In Chinese, she became more formal, more deferential. Her hand gestures became smaller and more controlled. Even her posture changed subtly to reflect Chinese cultural norms. "Shall we begin?" General Morrison asked. Elena interpreted the question into Mandarin, and Ambassador Chen nodded. 请告诉将军，我们很感激他抽出时间来讨论这个重要的合作机会。Please tell the general that we are grateful for his time to discuss this important cooperation opportunity. As Elena translated Ambassador Chen's words back into English, she found herself falling into the rhythm that had once been as natural as breathing, not just converting words from one language to another, but conveying meaning, tone, and cultural context. When Ambassador Chen made a subtle joke in Mandarin, Elena found an equivalent way to express the humor in English that would make sense to General Morrison. The negotiation was complex, involving military technology transfers, manufacturing partnerships, and delicate questions of intellectual property. Elena found herself navigating not just language barriers but cultural ones as well. When the Chinese delegation used indirect language to express concerns, she helped General Morrison understand the underlying meaning. When the general's direct American communication style seemed to make the Chinese representatives uncomfortable, she softened his words without changing their essential meaning. The ambassador is saying that while they appreciate your directness, General, they would prefer to approach the timeline discussion more gradually, Elena explained during a particularly tense moment. In Chinese business culture, pushing too hard too fast can be seen as disrespectful. General Morrison nodded and adjusted his approach accordingly. Elena watched as he demonstrated the flexibility and cultural intelligence that had made him successful in international affairs. He was learning from her interpretations, using her not just as a translator but as a cultural bridge. After 2 hours of intense negotiation, Ambassador Chen sat back in his chair with visible satisfaction. 请告诉将军，这是我在美国参加过的最富有成效的会议之一, he said to Elena. Please tell the general that this has been one of the most productive meetings I've attended in America. As Elena translated, she added context that Ambassador Chen hadn't explicitly stated, but that she understood from his tone and body language. Ambassador Chen is not just being polite, General. He's genuinely impressed. The Chinese delegation came here expecting typical American negotiation tactics, but your willingness to work within their cultural framework has made a significant impact. General Morrison's eyes sharpened with interest. What do you mean by typical American negotiation tactics? Elena glanced at Ambassador Chen, who nodded for her to continue. Americans often approach international negotiations as if everyone thinks and communicates the same way they do. They focus on quick decisions and immediate results. But in Chinese culture, business relationships are built slowly over time, with careful attention to respect and face-saving. And how did I do differently today? You listened more than you spoke. You asked questions about their concerns rather than just presenting your own position. And when they needed time to consult among themselves, you didn't pressure them for immediate answers. Ambassador Chen smiled and said something in Mandarin that made his colleagues chuckle. Elena translated. Ambassador Chen says that most American generals try to negotiate like they're commanding troops. You negotiated like someone who understands that different battles require different strategies. General Morrison actually smiled at that, and Elena found herself smiling too. This was what she had missed most about her old job, not just the intellectual challenge of translation, but the satisfaction of helping people from different cultures understand and respect each other. As the Chinese delegation prepared to leave, Ambassador Chen approached Elena directly. Speaking in Mandarin, he said, 如果您曾经考虑回到外交工作，我们将很荣幸与您合作. If you ever consider returning to diplomatic work, we would be honored to work with you. Elena felt a flush of pride and gratitude. 谢谢您的好意，今天能为您服务是我的荣幸. Thank you for your kindness. It has been my honor to serve you today. After the Chinese delegation left, the library fell silent except for the ticking of the grandfather clock. Elena stood by the window, still processing the intensity of the past few hours. She had forgotten how much she thrived in this environment, how naturally the skills came back to her. General Morrison was reviewing his notes, but Elena could feel his attention focused on her. Finally, he spoke. That was exceptional work, Ms. Martinez. Thank you, sir. You did more than translate. You helped me understand not just what they were saying, but what they were thinking. That's a rare skill. Elena turned from the window to face him. Understanding context is as important as understanding words. Maybe more important. General Morrison set down his pen and looked at her directly. The Syrian delegation arrives in an hour. But before they do, I need to ask you something. Elena felt a familiar tightness in her chest. She had been dreading this moment, knowing it would eventually come. Why is someone with your qualifications working as a maid? Elena was quiet for a long moment, looking out the window at the perfectly manicured gardens. Finally, she turned back to face General Morrison, and he saw something in her eyes that hadn't been there before, vulnerability mixed with determination. Because 3 years ago I made a mistake that cost me everything, she said quietly, and I've been trying to disappear ever since. General Morrison's expression didn't change, but Elena saw something shift in his eyes. Recognition, perhaps, or understanding. He gestured to one of the leather chairs near the fireplace. "We have 45 minutes before the Syrian delegation arrives," he said quietly. "Tell me." Elena sat down slowly, her hands folded in her lap. For 3 years, she had kept this story locked away, telling herself that talking about it would only make the pain worse. But now, looking at General Morrison's patient face, she realized that keeping it buried had been slowly poisoning her. 3 years ago, I was the lead interpreter for a critical negotiation between the United States and several Middle Eastern countries, Elena began. It was about oil rights in a disputed region. Billions of dollars were at stake and the political implications were enormous. She paused, remembering the conference room in Washington, the tension in the air, the weight of responsibility on her shoulders. The negotiations had been going on for weeks and everyone was exhausted. I had been working 18-hour days, switching between Arabic, Persian, and English constantly. I was running on caffeine and adrenaline. General Morrison leaned forward slightly, his attention complete. During the final session, there was a crucial moment when the Iranian representative made a statement in Persian. It was complex, with multiple layers of meaning. In Persian, the same phrase can be interpreted as either a concession or a threat, depending on the context and tone. Elena's voice grew quieter. I interpreted it as a concession. I told the American delegation that Iran was agreeing to compromise on a key point. But I was wrong. The Iranian representative was actually delivering an ultimatum. She closed her eyes, reliving the moment that had destroyed her career. Based on my interpretation, the American team made a counteroffer that the Iranians saw as insulting. They walked out of the negotiations immediately. The entire deal collapsed. General Morrison was silent, waiting for her to continue. The media found out about the interpretation error within days. Someone leaked it to the press, probably to deflect blame from the political leadership. Suddenly, my name was in newspapers across the country. State Department interpreter's mistake costs billions. Translation error destroys Middle East peace deal. Elena opened her eyes and looked directly at General Morrison. I became a scapegoat. The State Department quietly asked for my resignation. Other government agencies wouldn't touch me. Private companies were afraid that hiring me would damage their reputations. In a matter of weeks, I went from being one of the most respected interpreters in Washington to being completely unemployable. "And you've been hiding ever since," General Morrison said, and there was no judgment in his voice. "I ran out of savings after 6 months of unemployment. I couldn't find work in my field, and I was too proud to ask my family for help. When I saw the job posting for a maid position here, it seemed like the perfect place to disappear. Mr. Blackwood never asked for references beyond basic employment history. He just needed someone reliable who could clean and stay invisible." Elena laughed bitterly. Invisible. That's exactly what I wanted to be. I thought if I could just hide long enough, maybe the shame would go away. Maybe I could figure out how to start over. But it didn't work, General Morrison observed. No, it didn't. For 3 years I've been scrubbing floors and pretending that my education and experience didn't matter. I told myself that I was better off as a maid than as a failed diplomat. But today, when I heard you speaking about languages and interpretation, Elena's voice trailed off. "You remembered who you really are?" General Morrison finished. Elena nodded. "I remembered that I love languages not just because I'm good at them, but because they connect people. They build bridges between cultures. Today, when I was interpreting for Ambassador Chen, I felt alive again for the first time in 3 years." General Morrison was quiet for a long moment, studying Elena's face. Then he leaned back in his chair and spoke thoughtfully. "Ms. Martinez, in my 30 years of military service, I've seen many people make mistakes. Some were small errors in judgment. Others were catastrophic failures that cost lives. Do you know what I learned from watching those people?" Elena shook her head. "I learned that the measure of a person isn't whether they make mistakes. Everyone makes mistakes. The measure of a person is what they do after the mistake. Some people let it destroy them. Others learn from it and become stronger." He stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the gardens. "From what I witnessed today, your skills haven't diminished at all. If anything, your experience with failure might have made you more careful, more attentive to nuance." Elena felt something stirring in her chest that she hadn't felt in years. Hope. "The Syrian delegation is arriving in 30 minutes, General Morrison continued, turning back to face her. Ambassador Khalil is known for being particularly difficult. He's walked out of 3 negotiations in the past year because he felt the interpreters were incompetent or biased. Elena straightened in her chair. What are you saying, General? I'm saying that I need someone who understands the weight of responsibility, who knows the cost of mistakes, and who has the skills to navigate complex cultural and linguistic challenges. I'm saying that I need you. Before Elena could respond, there was a knock at the library door. Mr. Blackwood entered, looking nervous and apologetic. General, I'm terribly sorry to interrupt, but the Syrian delegation has arrived early. They're requesting to begin the meeting immediately. General Morrison nodded and turned to Elena. Are you ready? Elena stood up, smoothing her navy suit. For the first time in 3 years, when someone asked if she was ready for a professional challenge, her answer came without hesitation. Yes, sir. I'm ready. As they prepared to leave the library, General Morrison placed a gentle hand on Elena's shoulder. Ms. Martinez, today isn't about redemption. Today is about moving forward. The past 3 years weren't wasted time. They were preparation for this moment. Elena felt tears prick at her eyes, but she blinked them back. There would be time for emotions later. Right now, she had work to do. The Syrian delegation was already seated in the formal conference room when Elena and General Morrison entered. Ambassador Khalil was a stern-looking man in his 50s with intelligent dark eyes that seemed to miss nothing. His 2 associates flanked him on either side, both looking equally serious and professional. Elena took her position and waited. She had studied Ambassador Khalil's file during her State Department days. He was brilliant, demanding, and had little patience for cultural insensitivity or linguistic incompetence. This would be the true test of whether she still had what it took to operate at the highest levels of international diplomacy. Ambassador Khalil looked at Elena with obvious skepticism. In Arabic, he said to his associates, another American interpreter who probably learned Arabic from textbooks and thinks she understands our culture. Elena remained perfectly composed, giving no indication that she had understood every word. This was a test, and she knew exactly how to handle it. When General Morrison began his opening remarks, Elena translated them into flawless classical Arabic, using the formal diplomatic register that showed respect for the ambassador's status and education. She was careful to maintain the general's tone while adapting his words to fit Arabic rhetorical patterns. Ambassador Khalil's eyebrows rose slightly, but he said nothing. As the meeting progressed, Elena found herself navigating increasingly complex linguistic territory. The discussion involved technical military specifications, legal terminology, and subtle diplomatic language that carried multiple layers of meaning. She moved seamlessly between formal classical Arabic and more conversational modern Arabic, adjusting her style to match the context and the speaker. When Ambassador Khalil made a particularly complex point about regional security concerns, Elena didn't just translate his words. She conveyed the deep cultural and historical context behind his statement, helping General Morrison understand not just what the ambassador was saying, but why he was saying it and what it meant for the broader negotiation. Ambassador Khalil is referencing the 1916 Sykes-Picot Agreement, Elena explained quietly to General Morrison during a brief pause. When he talks about artificial boundaries, he's not just discussing current military positions. He's expressing a century-old grievance about how Western powers carved up the Middle East without consulting the people who lived there. Understanding this context is crucial to addressing his underlying concerns. General Morrison nodded, and Elena watched as he adjusted his approach to acknowledge these deeper historical sensitivities. It was exactly the kind of cultural intelligence that made the difference between successful and failed negotiations. Halfway through the meeting, Ambassador Khalil suddenly switched to a regional Syrian dialect, speaking rapidly and with obvious emotion about civilian casualties in recent conflicts. It was a deliberate test. Most interpreters would struggle with the rapid, emotional speech in an unfamiliar dialect. Elena didn't miss a beat. She had spent time in Syria during her graduate studies, and she recognized the dialect immediately. More importantly, she understood that Ambassador Khalil wasn't just conveying information. He was expressing genuine pain and frustration about the human cost of regional conflicts. When she translated his words into English, Elena made sure that General Morrison heard not just the ambassador's concerns, but the emotional weight behind them. She used language that conveyed the ambassador's passion without making him sound unprofessional or unstable. The effect was immediate. General Morrison's entire demeanor shifted as he realized that this wasn't just a political or military discussion, it was deeply personal for Ambassador Khalil. The general's response was more thoughtful, more compassionate, and more genuine than his earlier diplomatic language. Ambassador Khalil noticed the change immediately. He looked at Elena with new respect and said in Arabic, "You understand not just our words, but our hearts." Elena replied in the same dialect the ambassador had used, "Language is more than words, Ambassador. It carries the soul of a people." For the first time since entering the room, Ambassador Khalil smiled. The remaining meetings of the day passed in a blur of languages and cultures. Elena found herself switching between Russian with the Eastern European delegation, Italian with the Vatican's trade representatives, German with the Industrial Consortium, French with the West African Diplomatic Mission, and Spanish with the Latin American ambassadors. Each transition felt natural, like slipping into a different outfit that fit perfectly. With each delegation, Elena didn't just change languages, she adapted her entire approach. Her posture became more formal with the Germans, more warm and personal with the Italians, more hierarchical with the Russians. She understood that successful interpretation wasn't just about words, but about becoming a cultural bridge. By the time the final meeting concluded at 8 in the evening, Elena felt exhausted, but exhilarated. It was the kind of tiredness that came from using every skill you possessed, from being fully engaged and challenged. She hadn't felt this way in 3 years. General Morrison had been watching her throughout the day, and Elena could see his assessment evolving with each successful interaction. She had proven herself not just competent, but exceptional. More than that, she had demonstrated the kind of cultural intelligence and diplomatic instinct that couldn't be taught from textbooks. As the last delegation departed, General Morrison and Elena found themselves alone in the conference room. The table was covered with documents in 7 different languages, evidence of the day's complex negotiations. "Ms. Martinez," General Morrison said, loosening his tie slightly, "I need to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before you answer." Elena straightened in her chair, suddenly alert. "Yes, sir? How would you feel about leaving this house permanently?" Elena's heart skipped. "Sir?" General Morrison walked to the window and looked out at the darkening sky. "I'm offering you a position with my organization. Full rehabilitation of your security clearance, international travel, complex diplomatic assignments. You would be working at the highest levels of government again, but this time with an organization that values your experience and understands the true measure of your abilities." Elena stared at him, barely able to process what she was hearing. "General, my reputation, the scandal. Your reputation will be rebuilt based on your performance, not your past. As for the scandal..." General Morrison turned back to face her. "Ms. Martinez, I've done my research on you. The Iranian negotiation that ended your career? The interpretation you made wasn't wrong." Elena felt the room spinning slightly. "What do you mean?" The Iranian representative spoke in a deliberately ambiguous way. "Your interpretation was actually the more accurate one, based on the linguistic evidence. But certain parties in the American delegation needed the negotiations to fail for political reasons. You were made a scapegoat to cover up their sabotage." Elena's legs felt weak. She gripped the edge of the table. "How do you know this?" "Because I was investigating defense contract irregularities at the time, and your case kept appearing in my files. The timing was too convenient, the media leaks too coordinated. It took me 2 years to piece together what really happened, but by then you had disappeared." Elena felt tears running down her cheeks. For 3 years she had carried the weight of believing she had destroyed an international negotiation through incompetence. To learn that she had been deliberately sacrificed was overwhelming. "I've been looking for you for over a year," General Morrison continued. "When I heard about the Blackwood dinner and learned that they employed a maid named Elena Martinez, I had to investigate. The missing interpreter today wasn't a coincidence, Ms. Martinez. I arranged for Mr. Patterson to be delayed because I wanted to see if you were who I thought you were." Elena looked up at him through her tears. You planned all of this? I planned the opportunity. What you did with it was entirely your own choice, and you exceeded every expectation I had. Elena wiped her eyes and tried to collect herself. General, I appreciate what you're offering, but I've been out of the field for 3 years. I've been scrubbing floors and staying invisible. I'm not sure I'm ready to be visible again. General Morrison smiled, and for the first time since she'd met him, his expression was genuinely warm. Ms. Martinez, today you handled 7 different diplomatic delegations flawlessly. You navigated complex cultural sensitivities, translated technical military specifications, and helped me negotiate deals worth hundreds of millions of dollars. You didn't just prove that you're ready to be visible again, you proved that you never should have been invisible in the first place. Elena looked around the conference room, at the evidence of the day's success scattered across the table. She thought about the past 3 years of hiding, of shrinking herself down to nothing, of believing that she deserved to be invisible. Then she thought about Ambassador Chen's smile when she spoke to him in perfect Mandarin. About Ambassador Khalil's respect when she understood not just his words but his heart. About the feeling of using her skills to build bridges between people from different worlds. What would this position involve? Elena asked quietly. You would be my senior linguistic and cultural advisor. You would travel with me to international negotiations, serve as interpreter for sensitive diplomatic missions, and help develop cultural intelligence strategies for complex international situations. The work would be challenging, sometimes dangerous, and always important. Elena stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the mansion's gardens. 3 years ago, she had come here broken and ashamed, believing that hiding was her only option. Tonight, she was being offered a chance not just to return to her former life, but to exceed it. There's something I need to tell you, Elena said, turning back to General Morrison. When I made that interpretation error 3 years ago, even though you're telling me it wasn't really an error, I learned something important. I learned that words have power, and that power carries responsibility. I learned that being invisible isn't always wrong. Sometimes the most important thing an interpreter can do is disappear completely, to become a transparent bridge between speakers. She paused, gathering her thoughts. But I also learned that hiding from responsibility isn't the same as bearing it with humility. For 3 years I've been hiding. Tonight I remembered what it feels like to bear responsibility with pride. General Morrison nodded. Does that mean you'll accept the position? Elena looked around the conference room one more time, then at her reflection in the darkened window. The woman looking back at her was no longer invisible. She was no longer broken. She was Elena Sofia Martinez, master of 7 languages, builder of bridges between cultures, and someone who had learned that her mistakes didn't define her. Her response to them did. Yes, General Morrison, Elena said with quiet confidence. I accept. As they shook hands, Elena felt something she hadn't experienced in 3 years. She felt like herself again. Not the person she had been before the scandal, but someone new. Someone who carried her scars with dignity and her skills with purpose. The invisible maid was gone forever. In her place stood a woman who understood that true strength came not from never falling, but from learning how to rise again with grace. Outside, the lights of the mansion twinkled against the darkness, but Elena was no longer looking back. She was looking forward, toward a future where her voice would be heard in 7 languages, where her skills would serve a purpose greater than herself, and where she would never again allow anyone to make her invisible. The general had frozen. When she first spoke in those 7 languages, not with shock but with recognition. He had seen not a maid but a master of her craft who had simply been waiting for the right moment to step back into the light.